All right. Good afternoon. So we're going to start this webinar here. The idea here is to describe the draft cybersecurity certification candidate scheme for EUDI wallets and the EID schemes under which they are provided, which is the formal name for the cybersecurity scheme for the wallets. My name is Vetillard. I'm a lead certification expert at ENISA and actually leading this work here on the certification of EUDI wallet. So about the agenda here, we'll start by looking at the legal context and the status. Then we'll look into the objectives of the scheme, then the specific points of attention. And then a little bit about the security requirements and the next steps, and hopefully there will be some time for questions in the end. So please don't hesitate to enter some questions in the Q&A. We will answer you, try to get some of the answers at the end of the session here. All right. So starting with the legal context and the status, certification of the wallets is actually a requirement from EIDAS. It says that the conformity has to be certified. The conformity of what? Of the European digital identity wallets and the EID schemes under which they are provided. So that's the what we need to certify, and with the requirements laid down in other articles, 5A in particular, and by whom? By conformity assessment bodies designated by the member state. So this is a responsibility of the member states, so not exactly what we are talking about here today, but this is introduced in this second part of this article here, where tells us that the certification of the conformity of requirements that are related to cybersecurity has to be carried out with an EU scheme as defined in the Cybersecurity Act. So this is really where we get the original thing here. Then, if you look still in the EIDAS of the Article 5A defining the digital identity wallet, the paragraph 4 is about basically what a wallet does. So it lists a number of things that have to be done on a PID and attestations. Importantly, the first word in paragraph A is securely. So this means that this particular paragraph is quite relevant for what we're doing in terms of cybersecurity. Now, there's a long list of functional requirements with many references also to security, etc. So all of these are the basis for basically what we are doing here. And now, the paragraph 5 of this Article 5A actually gives a little bit of more information about what is expected from the wallet in terms of implementation. So I've just outlined two. One of them is the support of common protocols and interfaces, which means that there has to be some kind of a functional testing here when you do certification according to that. The other one being that it has to meet the requirement of assurance level high as defined in the EIDAS, in particular for anything related to basically identity proofing, verification, and EID means management authentication. So basically things that are related really to the management and use of PID. The assurance level high, as it's defined in the Article 8, actually refers to EID means. So it refers to the parts of the wallets that are considered as being an EID means. Once again, mostly the handling of the PID. It's really is about the degree of confidence in the claim asserted identity. And you see that this purpose is to prevent the misuse and alteration of the identity. So that's really what we're talking about here when we talk about assurance level. And well, the high is not very well defined because it's just defined as being higher than substantial. And it's importantly characterized by technical specs, standards, procedures, and technical controls. And we see these actually in some of the implementing regulations. So here it's 2015-1502, where there are actually some technical specs and procedures that are defined for, in particular, assurance level high. Here, 4 EID means. So this is something we all need to keep in mind. This is from 2015. It hasn't been revised. So it means that it doesn't know about the wallet. It only talks about EID means. So we have sometimes to try to understand what it implies or doesn't imply for the other functions provided by the wallet here. Now, another regulation that is very important is the Cybersecurity Act, because basically the scheme is developed in accordance to that. So ENISA has received a request from the Commission. Then we started preparing a candidate scheme by first establishing an ad hoc working group. And this working group has been helping us since the beginning with the specific advice and expertise. The next steps that we are getting into right now is that we actually need to consult the relevant stakeholders through a consultation process, and we also need to take utmost account of the opinion of the ECCG, which is a group of all the national cybersecurity certification authorities from the member states. We have to do that before we transmit the candidate scheme to the Commission. So in terms of other relevant regulation, I mean, there are quite a lot, particularly in terms of the implementing acts. As you can see, there's actually one with the 2026-798, which is from yesterday on remote onboarding. So we can expect that this will keep on coming a little bit still. And we also have some other regulations that apply. Of course, GDPR, because PID, obviously, and attestations are considered as personal data, so we have to be very careful with all of these. NIS2, because at least in some member states, as even today, the wallet providers are in scope of NIS2 and in national regulations, and also there's a proposal to include them for all member states later. And CRA, because there are some product components, so some of them may actually be subject to the CRA requirement here. In terms of the current status, we reached the point where we have some kind of maturity. So we received the request at the end of 2024. The ad hoc working group started a little bit more than a year ago in March 2025. We had some thematic groups, we circulated some drafts, and we worked mostly on the difficult topics. Most of them have been addressed, many of them, but there are still a few that are ongoing, on which the discussions, I would say, have not yet completely concluded. It looks like the right time for organizing the public survey. If you look at the core scheme and its principles, the annexes, we have reached a level of maturity that is satisfactory. It's not finished yet, so it's still the right time to get some interesting feedback on board. The work on the screen criteria, the requirements, is less advanced. But once again, it's sufficiently advanced so that we can get some feedback. Here, it's going to be a little bit different, more about thinking about the principles so that we make sure that when we start consolidating of these requirements, we do it on the right basis, but we'll come back to that. Right now, let's look into the objectives of the scheme. So the idea here is to have one EU scheme. So this EU scheme is about cybersecurity, and its main goal is to certify, once again, the EU DI wallet together with the underlying EID scheme. Now, we also thought that it would be interesting to allow other kinds of certificates to be issued, in particular to have the possibility to issue certificates for specific wallet solutions, so that the wallet provider that provides a solution to several member states doesn't have to certify everything many times. So there can be some reuse of a certification of the wallet solution by itself. And same thing, if a member state or any other kind of PID provider needs to work with several different wallets, then it makes sense to actually have this PID provider and the service that they provide being certified once, and then the result is reused in different combinations. But the very important thing here is that this EU scheme has to be integrated into 27 national certification systems. And the idea here is that every member state has to set up one national scheme that is basically the overall certification, the one that is notified to the Commission. So the Commission gets the list of all the wallets and EID schemes to which such a certificate has been issued. But then this one is at the heart of a system in every member state, and the system will include the EU scheme. Right now, it has in most cases some equivalent that deals with the cybersecurity aspect, but it may also include some other schemes, such as a functional scheme that will deal with all the functional testing, because once again, what we deal with in the European scheme is only the cybersecurity aspects, so there are some aspects that are not completely covered here. Now, if we look at the overview of the certification process, this is quite classical for anybody who's familiar with the 17065 or 17021, all the standards for certification. It starts with the application and application review. Then it goes on with stage 1 of the evaluation, which is mostly a documentary review and the planning of the evaluation. Then we have stage 2, that is the main evaluation, where the auditing, the testing actually takes place. Then we go into the certification phase, where we first have a review of the result of the evaluation that leads to a certification decision. And if that decision is positive, then a certificate is issued. And as soon as the certificate is issued, then we move into surveillance, and we'll see how that happens. Now, if we look at stage 1, so stage 1, the idea is to take as input a lot of information that is given by the service provider, then to use some information that is actually part of the scheme, the risk register and the criteria, go through the process and get out what we need to do the main audit, which is the evaluation criteria and the evaluation activity. So in more detail, the information required, it's a lot of public information, all the user guidance, all the documentation, any contacts related to vulnerability management. Those are mandatory in the CSA, also made mandatory with even more details for CRA for the parts that are actually subject to that. Then we have the description of the service itself with the list of all the components that are in it, and also all of the assumptions that need to be made by these components, which basically means that these assumptions turn into requirements on the system in which they are integrated. And also a list of deviations where the components don't exactly match the criteria that we have for them. So once again, we need to have some other things there. Sorry. Then we have the certification information. Once again, assurance information, anything that is related to possible evaluations, reports, certificates that may be available on the components, and again, the guidance. And the guidance from the user, once again, will turn into some kind of requirements. And finally, we have the risk assessment to make sure that all the risks related to the service provider has been identified, and that at least the ones that are part of the risk register have been covered. Yeah, and so it wasn't the service description that we have the certification information. So that's basically anything we need in terms of assurance information and the guidance on the components and the risk assessment, which is based on the risk register. And this risk register includes some high-level risks and also a large number of specific threats, and all of these needs to be mitigated. Now, we also have a number of criteria. That's basically the security requirements. They're defined here in the separate documents. They cover all of the components, product, services, process components. Okay, so in the stage one, we basically have three main activities here that are defined in the scheme. One of them is the dependency analysis. So this is about analyzing the assurance information and determining, once again, some requirements based on the assumptions or the guidance that we have on of these components to make sure that any component that has been certified is used in the conditions that it was certified for being used into. So this is actually important, and we'll see that there's a difference between the origin of the component and how it has been certified. Then we have the design evaluation. This is basically a big review of the documentation, but also an important part of it is to validate the fact that the deviations are acceptable, which mostly means that there's a possibility to have some mitigation that is proposed, and that this mitigation still allows the overall service to cover all the risks that have been identified in the risk assessment. So here, once again, it will determine additional requirements from the deviation mitigation. Finally, we have the evaluation of the risk assessment. Here, the idea is to really make sure that the risk register is covered, that the risk assessment has been done properly, and of course, that all risks are mitigated by the proposed criteria. So when we get out of stage one, we basically have what we need to do the main audit and testing, the stage two. We have some evaluation criteria that are specific for the service. So they're based on the scheme criteria, but some of them are excluded. So for instance, first we only could keep the applicable one. If you're only certifying a wallet solution, you don't need to keep the requirements on the PID provider. And also, since there's been the mitigation of deviation, if a deviation was identified and recognized, there's no need to keep this requirement. There's going to be some other requirements added there, which are the ones from the mitigation, and also some criteria coming from the guidance for all of the components. So basically, we have here a set of criteria that is used only for that evaluation, but these criteria must be met. Here, if you don't meet one of these criteria, now it's becoming a non-conformity. Now, about the evaluation activities, they are mostly based on the controls. So are mapped to the criteria. So you identify which controls actually participate to meeting each criteria. And we only give here a high-level definition, and this high-level definition is refined in stage two during the main audit and testing. So here, when we get to stage two, we start from, of course, the output of stage one, when we add all the information about the ICT service itself, and the result is an evaluation technical report. So in terms of the information required, this is supposed to be an on-site evaluation. So there's, of course, access to the site, to the employees, to the documents. And some of these documents would include first the policies, the design, the code, which is basically all the basis for the evidence to be audited, to be inspected, to make sure that everything is there. And then we have the records, the logs, the live access whenever is needed. And the idea here is mostly to verify the operational effectiveness and also to do the functional testing and the penetration testing. So if we look at the activities that we have here, mostly they are defined by the CEN technical spec 18072, which defines methodology for the evaluation of services. So it was originally made for cloud services, but it's currently being updated to be able to cover all kinds of services. The idea here is that it's based on the controls that are proposed by the service, whether they are technical controls such as security functions or operational control, or organizational controls, all of them. And basically, they have two steps. One of them is to check on the suitability and the design of the controls, which means that we're checking that the controls actually cover all the criteria, which means that if the controls are operated correctly, then they should meet the criteria. And then the next stage is the operating effectiveness, which is focused on the control and making sure that the controls are indeed being operated properly. So here there's a little bit of an asterisk, because one of the issues we have is that in order to be operated, a wallet service actually needs to be certified first and then notified to the commission, and then it starts going. So typically, the operating effectiveness would be evaluated about the service running for about 6 months or a year or something like that. Here, it's complicated for the first evaluation because obviously the service cannot run before it is certified. So the operating effectiveness will be limited based on maybe some intermediary testing or pre-production stage, but it won't be the full operating effectiveness, which will then happen at the end of the first year in the first annual surveillance evaluation. We also have some functional testing. So here it's inspired strongly from the ATE class from common criteria. And basically, you have to demonstrate that all the security functions, the technical controls, that the coverage is good, that all the tests have been passed. And there needs to be an observation or the performance of a sample of the test, just to make sure that the test actually pass. Finally, there's a vulnerability assessment, also inspired from common criteria. Here, the AVA-1. So here, it's also the quite classical thing where you search for known vulnerabilities, then you perform an independent vulnerability analysis, and then penetration testing. So, of course, the vulnerability analysis will focus on the specificities of the wallet. For instance, I mean, if there have been some deviations, maybe that will be a particular point of interest here. Now, stage 2. At the end of stage 2 is the ETR. So that's the report that is used for the certification. So the evaluator delivers this to the certifier, but there have to be different teams. And then the certifier reviews, makes sure that everything has been done, following basically all the principles that have been described for stage 1 and for stage 2. That, of course, that there haven't been any non-conformities, or at least that the non-conformities have been fixed. And so the report here needs to describe all of the evaluation activities, all the results, and of course, all the information on the non-conformities. In the ETR for composition, this is a kind of a subset of the ETR with some details that are removed, and it's used for two things. If the scope of the certification here is complete, the wallet and the EID scheme, then it's used with the national scheme as the input for cybersecurity. Now, if it only covers a subset, like a wallet on the EID, then it's going to be used for composition with for the full certification. Now, let's look a little bit how composition happens in EUDIW. Take an example here based on existing components. So we have somebody who's been already doing some activities and now moving to do some wallets. So we can assume that they already have a certified WSCD. Maybe it was already a certified QSCD before, but basically it has all the functions needed. So it gets its UCC certificate. They also have the corresponding WSCA, the application that manages the WSCD, and the number of wallet instances, that is the applications that run the user interface. There are several of them because, of course, very often we will target more than one platform. So the proposal here would be that EUCC is used for the evaluation of a WSCA, which leads to another EUCC certificate. And also, we are developing a profile for FITSAM, so that for the wallet instances, so that it will be a possibility to get a FITSAM certificate there. And as you noticed, FITSAM here is put in orange in the sense that these certificates will not be considered exactly as the same. The EUCC certificate will fall into the full composition thing, where a lot of it is trusted. We know a lot about how this thing is being done. Whereas for FITSAM, we're talking about national schemes, potentially even private schemes, because FITSAM is only a specific technical spec from CEN. So we know that there are some national implementations in several member states, but there could also be some private implementations of it. So we need to make sure for these kind of certificates that they cover what they're supposed to cover, but also that the CB who issued the certificate can be fully trusted, that the process is good, etc., etc. So all of these checks are part of the dependency analysis. And here we will also assume that the wallet provider happens to be a TSP, who's already been certified with the 319.4 something requirements, which means that they have a number of components that are already good. They should have some things that are good, basically a good ISMS that would allow for a number of things. So once again, this one has to be checked a little bit more carefully, but this is part, if you remember, of stage 1. So this is something that is being done. You go through the process of the full process of the EUDIW, and then you get the first certificate for a wallet solution service. So this is not the full certificates, but it's already a first step. And then the idea would be to combine it with something else. Here we have maybe a previously notified EID scheme. So it went through a peer review. Hopefully, for this peer review, there's been some audits or some testing that has been done, and that could be reused because it was done maybe with an accredited CAB or whatever. So we can take all kinds of inputs into consideration again, and at the end, we can issue the final cybersecurity certificates for the wallet solution service combined with the EID scheme, and then provide that to the member states for the overall certification. Now, if we look into the certification life cycle, we've tried to simplify it as much as possible. So there's an initial evaluation, and then there's a surveillance evaluation every year until we go for the recertification evaluation. The validity of certificates is up to 5 years. It doesn't have to be 5 years. If a certification body has good reasons to believe that some issues will occur in 2 or 3 years or whatever, then they can issue a shorter certificate. But the 5 years is the maximum, which is aligned both with the UCC and with the IDAS. So we only have one type of surveillance evaluation, and we only have one type because it does include an update of the vulnerability assessment. So there is a requirement in EIDAS to have a vulnerability assessment performed every 2 years, but basically we do an update of the vulnerability assessment every year, so there's no need to have a specific one. As we mentioned before, the first surveillance evaluation is likely to include a full evaluation of the operating effectiveness, because it most likely will not be performed completely during the initial evaluation. And overall, the surveillance evaluation is already quite complex. Of course, part of the evaluation is going to be anything that has changed. So you need to review any change in the service that is provided, also any change in the certificates. So if there's a new certificate for one of the components, you need to check that the guidance has not changed and things like that. So in addition, we're going to have the obligation to review a number of processes. So in particular, vulnerability management, to make sure that vulnerabilities have been handled correctly. Also incident management, fraud management, and anything related to development. So development and change management. So all of these, they have to be evaluated every year. And the main reason for that is that there are some obligations to notify CABs about relevant vulnerabilities, incidents, or changes. So there are some conditions for doing that, but we make sure that at least every year the CAB gets an overall view of anything that has happened on the product here. So if we look into a few specific points of attention, first, if you're familiar with the text for EUCC, you may have noticed that the scheme that's being proposed here starts from the same structure of the scheme, that many parts are basically very much harmonized. So they have the same structure, the same chapters with pretty much the same content, but always with some important adaptations. So if you think, for instance, of the issuance, renewal, withdrawal of certificates, most of it is about the same. The conditions, of course, are different. And also, we've introduced this notion of certificate amendments, because the idea here is that it's much more likely that there will be some changes in something as complex as the whole what EUDI wallet and the EID scheme. So we don't want to issue a full new certificate every time. So we will proceed by amendments and between two recertifications. In addition, in the chapters related to compliance monitoring, or also to the consequences of non-conformity, non-compliance, and also actually vulnerability management, we've introduced the notion of materiality, which is basically the distinction between minor and major vulnerabilities, changes, or whatever. The idea being that we have a threshold under which there's no need to notify the CAB of a given vulnerability or a change, and the threshold is supposed to be whether or not the change or vulnerability or impact of the vulnerability is material for the user, which means that it could actually change the decision of the user about trusting the product. So this is a difference with the UCC. I think it makes a lot of sense for services in order to avoid getting with the CAB all the time. There's been also changes in the peer assessment, removal of the sampling rules, because we expect a much lower number of certificates. Also, this is what makes the composition with the UCC much simpler, because of all these similarities. Then, of course, it's very much easier to trust the EUCC certificates, because pretty much they are part of the same framework. So they abide to the same rules for many things. In terms of the level of assurance, so here, this is when we start having a few peculiarities, because we have two levels of assurance. In the Cybersecurity Act, we have actually used the assurance level high for the entire wallet. And for EIDAS, we have the assurance level high, which applies to the EUDI wallet when it's an EID means. So it looks like it's the same, but it's not, because the definitions of these assurance levels are different. We don't have the same in the Cybersecurity Act and from EIDAS. So if you consider it from a product viewpoint, for instance, in EUCC, the level high of Cybersecurity Act covers levels AVAVAN 3 to AVAVAN 5, whereas the level high of EIDAS mentions attackers with high attack potential. So there's no direct reference to common criteria, but if you read this with the common criteria in mind, you will understand AVAVAN 5. I think there's a consensus on the fact that the levels in EIDAS are actually higher than the levels in the CSA, which makes sense, because when you're dealing with identity, we are obviously dealing, whatever the level, you're dealing with something that is quite sensitive, whereas CSA is supposed to be covering all kinds of products, not only related to identity. So what does it mean for the wallet? For the wallet, we mean that we will require AVAVAN 5 level protection for the critical assets. That's mostly the cryptographic keys and a bit about the authentication of the user. And we're proposing that to use the AVAVAN 3 level protection for about everything else. Now, this is still in discussion, mostly because we have some issues with the underlying platforms. In particular, if you think about the mobile devices, they are typically not evaluated or certified, so it's very difficult to know what you can trust in a device. So the basic assumption here is to say that we will maybe ask the applications to protect themselves a little bit more, based on the assumption that they may be operating in a somewhat hostile environment, and to try to take some measures against that. But as I said, this is still under discussion, and there are different views about that. I think that the discussion is mostly about how we define the default and the exceptions, actually, on this, rather than the actual objectives. Now, what about the services and the processes here? It's actually less common to have assurance levels for the services and processes, but this is also one reason for selecting the CEN-TS 18072, because it does have levels, although it's very similar for levels substantial and high. But then we also have the interactions between these things. I take one example here, which is when we use the WSCA, which is supposed to be certified at AVAVAN 5 or equivalent with a UCC or equivalent. If it runs on a secure element, or if it runs on an HSM, it's no problem. Then we can do an AVAVAN 5 very easily. This is the normal composition. It will work, so we don't have any problem with that. Now, if it runs outside of a secure element or an HSM, then typically one of the examples that if it runs on a server to which the HSM is connected, then we have two possibilities. We can still evaluate AVAVAN 5, and then part of the security target will have a strong assumption of the environment, which means that we will have requirements coming in the evaluation criteria for the wall wallet on the environment. Or we can evaluate it at AVAVAN 3, which is lower than what we expected. So we say, okay, we have a deviation. And this deviation is going to be mitigated by having a strong environment. And we get, well, requirements on the environment. Hopefully, we get the same. So that's basically more or less two approaches that should lead to the same requirements on the environment about protecting the execution of the WSCA. So this is how the service component and the product components, how their evaluations is actually connected. Now, in terms of the CAB requirements, what we've been doing here is to base them on the ETSI EN 31943-1, which is the one used to certify trusted services and trusted service providers. But then we have added some authorization. So I think the idea here is that we consider that the wallet and the ID scheme that look a lot like TSP, so we can reuse the same principles, and also maybe that we could reuse the CABs that are already accredited to that standard by only extending the scope of their accreditation, which could make it easier, particularly if we can use the same standards for the national schemes, because we want to simplify accreditation as much as possible. However, we also defined an authorization process. So authorization is basically a complement of the accreditation in which some competences have to be validated by the NCCA. So it could be done completely independent of the accreditation process. Ideally, this is something that is done in synchronization between the NCCA and the national accreditation body, so that they do the work together, and in the end, you can get both accreditation and authorization more or less at the same time. The competences that we're looking for are very specific. It's basically the design evaluation, in particular the analysis of deviations, making sure that people have the right competences to do that. Also, the dependency analysis, looking at all the specific criteria that are defined for specific kind of assurance information, and basically anything related to combining assurance information into assurance that is global for a wallet service. The idea being that this is one of the most unusual things that we're doing here, this combination of product and service. So this is what is proposed as being the scope of the authorization. And in the end, of course, the vulnerability assessment with the penetration testing. In terms of the functional testing, as I mentioned, it's strongly inspired from the AT class. The developer needs to have some demonstration that the test coverage is sufficient. They need to show the record that they passed all tests, and the CAB to be able to do part of it. Now, if you look how this compares to the functional conformance testing, there are a few differences. First, the testing scope is different, because if you look at the functional conformance, which is something that is required for every national certification system, it would cover only the external interfaces, whereas here, the functional testing needs to cover as well the internal security functions and proprietary protocols, because this is the test of the security functions. Also, we don't cover all of the requirements. Those that are related to privacy, data protection, we're not that much interested into that, because we're looking into the cybersecurity here. In addition, the testing is basically here under the responsibility of the developer. There's only an obligation for a partial reperformance or even an observation. So it means that it's the CAB observing the developer passing the test. So it's actually quite different. So the interesting thing is that we have some interactions between these two ways of working. So the functional conformance certificates can be used as an evidence for all the external interfaces because it meets all of the requirements and even more, but not on the entire scope. And if, on the other hand, we want to use the testing that is performed in the cybersecurity scheme as the functional conformance testing, then we need to add a few tests and we need to require a full reperformance by the CAB. So I think this is an option that we've been proposing actually in the scheme, but it's not mandatory here. Now, if we move to the security requirement, here the important thing is to look at the guiding principle. We have a document here that's basically a first attempt at defining security requirements. Well, there have been more attempts before, but none of them made it to that stage. The idea is to define really some high-level reference requirements without going into too much details, mostly because we want this to work with any kind of combination of components, any kind of architecture. So it's very difficult to actually dive too deep into any detail. Obviously, the standards, the technical specification will define a lot more technical details, but we shouldn't make these was mandatory in particular when there are different options in the implementations. The version that we have made is based on the Commission's architecture reference framework, mostly because also the implementing acts that we've seen that were issued in 2024 are in the process of being revised. So we're waiting for the updated implementing acts to have the full view of all the standards that and technical specs that will apply. So the idea here is to start from mostly a functional view as provided by the high-level requirements of the ARF. And what we've done is that we've removed all of the requirements that could be tested with functional testing. So if something is going to be covered by the functional conformance testing because it's actually something that should be implemented by one of the standards there, we're not keeping it. The only ones that are of interest for us are things where we will actually need to do some inspections, some audits. So if there's any requirement that requires to have a policy and apply it, typically we know that we will have some audit, etc. And also it's not something that can be fully functionally tested. Similarly, if we have something that says this particular key has to be on the WS, stored in the WSCD, well, then we have to check that, making sure that it's actually stored there, not anywhere else, etc. So these are the kinds of requirements that we're looking at. And what we've been doing, because we're only keeping these requirements that go beyond the functional testing, we're including some notes on the conformity assessment of the requirements. Not everywhere, but everywhere when it's relevant. Yeah. So another important thing about this set of requirements is that it's incomplete as of today. So it only covers the really core functions of the wallet, which are the life cycle of the wallet itself and the provisioning, presentation, and life cycle of PID and attestations. So the thing is that there are many ways of defining the security requirements, many potential things. One of them is to start really from the legal requirements. So we'll have all of the implementing acts, including those that will be revised. That's a good way of doing it because at least those are the legal requirements. So we know that we're doing that. For instance, I've been using in this scheme in particular 2015-1502, making sure that all the requirements that I've put there were actually covered. So adding some of the requirements from that in the requirements. We can do that for all of the other documents. But okay, so now the question is, are they suitable? Are they detailed enough? Is that what we need? Now, the other options, which is the one we followed, is to use more of a functional basis, which basically starts mostly from the functional specifications. Then we have the opposite problem, which is, are we generic enough? Are we not getting into too much details and in the end missing the real point of the certification and of these requirements, which is to be able to cover everything. Another one is we made the decision to base our requirements on the EN 319-401, which is the basis for all the requirements on trust services and trust service providers in its latest version, so that it was also adapted to NIS2. Now, one of the big questions is that, are they sufficient for the wireless assurance level? I actually had to include and add a number of things from 2015-1502. So maybe there are some questions to be raised about that. So once again, those are the key questions that we're still somehow asking ourselves to see how we will make these requirements live. And this is also some of the questions we're asking you to answer on these security requirements. Now, we've made also a number of working assumptions, which can be imputed, but at least we made the assumptions. So we're not just doing it without saying anything. Basically, we have two user authorizations. One of them, which is called the main user authentication, that basically gives you access to the main app. So if you think about a mobile app, this is the authentication you do when you launch the app. You get access to a number of operations, those that are not the most critical ones. So the idea here would be to reuse maybe some of the authentication mechanisms provided by the devices on which we run, which makes us run into the issue of, but can we trust it? So it goes back to the discussion on the assurance levels once again about that. And then we have the second authentication, which is called the WSCD or WSA/WSCD authentication. And this is basically for every issuance or presentation of a PID or attestation that requires the use of the WSCD, just after the user confirmation, you get that authentication. So it basically used as an authentication and also as part of the authorization to actually access the WSCD. So here we satisfy the requirements of authentication from 2015-1502. This one is quite covered. It's verified. It has to be verified as part of the WSCD. So this is something important. So it has to cover several operations because there may be some management of some tokens, and so in particular for the PID and attestations. But basically, it's required at each time the user needs to confirm an operation. So as I said, the assurance level of the user authorization. So it has to be two-factor authentication, has to include an idle timeout. The required level should be AVAVAN 3. The problem, once again, is how do we reach this assurance level without having assurance on OS level authentication? So what kind of assumptions can we make? If we're making assumptions, how do we verify that this assumption is verified, etc.? So we can also use the wallet, have some mechanisms that are specific to the wallet, where we know that we can maybe get to a better assurance thing. So in particular, when we know that the OS level authentication is weak, but do we need to have that all the time? This is all the questions that we still need to answer fully. Another difference about all of the management and operation that are inherited from 319.401, there are a number of additions that come directly from 2015-1502, but the main addition is something about fraud management. And basically, all of these requirements, what they do is that they mandate to gather information about fraud and fraud attempts. And here, fraud is basically defined as something where you have a malicious agent that is, exploiting or trying to exploit something that is not part of the wallet. So it's either by exploiting basically the user by misleading the user into accepting something they shouldn't, or by doing something through a weakness in the, for instance, the mobile device on which it's running. So the first two things is about gathering information and analyzing the information that is being gathered, and then determining whether or not there's a root cause that's been identified and really creates an opportunity for fraud. Then you have to manage it as a vulnerability. So that's basically trying to introduce some new vulnerabilities that may not be considered normally as vulnerabilities. So for instance, if you take the example of abusing some users, if we see that there are a number of users that are getting abused by someone who convinces them that they can do something, maybe a warning message can be added, something like that. So this is really the idea about considering this as a vulnerability, and also mandating the sharing of this information with the CB and also between the member states on that. Then we have the wallet unit requirements. I mean, it covers the entire wallet units, so including some things that will also be covered by specific documents, like the wallet instance of the WSCA. The idea being that even if we propose, for instance, a protection profile to use with a particular methodology or scheme, there is a possibility to use alternative methods. So these high-level requirements are basically here exactly for that. So in terms of the general and life cycle requirements, it's about the wallet life cycle, the management of the WUHA. Then we have PIDs and attestations, provisioning, presentation, reissuance, revocation, etc. So a number of things about user authentication, orchestration, and authenticity of the messages. Those are requirements that apply to every operations that are called horizontal. And then we have some for wallet instance, WC, and key store. I'd like to attract your attention here to a few things. First, we're defining these horizontal requirements. So wondering if those actually make a lot of sense. A lot of them are inspired from external documents from OWASP in particular, but I think they make a lot of sense. So we have been proposing those. Another one is, should we actually separate the requirements for the wallet unit? I think that because they may be implemented actually quite a lot by the wallet provider in particular, if the wallet unit is implemented as a web app, I'd rather keep them together, but yeah, we can also discuss the fact of separating those. Finally, we have the wallet and PID provider requirements. It's there, of course, from the other side, looking at the wallet unit activation monitoring, the issuance of WUAs and revocation, and also the WEAs, and same thing for the PID and the not the attestation actually, because we only cover the PID providers. The attestation providers are supposed to be covered somewhere else as TSPs. So here it's all the basic things that you actually do with that. I don't think there's that many general debates on this chapter. It's mostly about how we present these requirements. For instance, there have been some discussion about reissuance. Should we cover this significantly or not? I think the main reason for covering this is that it looked to me as a former evaluator like an opportunity for attacks, but maybe we don't need to actually cover this in such detail. So please take a look and provide some feedback about that. So to finish here, what is next? So just a reminder, this is a draft candidate scheme. So draft is in the title, so it obviously means that it's not finished. It is quite advanced, but not finished. So the main focus right now that we've put into this was to complete the mechanisms. So that's why I presented quite in detail the way in which the evaluation goes, because I think on this one we made quite a progress. But now we have all of the parameters to that remain to be fully clarified. In particular, the reference assurance levels and how we deal with that. So now we have this idea of reference assurance levels and the possibility of a deviation, and we will most likely, include some or define either in the scheme or in guidance some typical deviations or things like that. So we're good, I would say, for the Line 5 for the critical assets. For identity critical system, we can require CSA high or CSA substantial, which for services are actually very similar in what they do. And for all the other rats, maybe CSA substantial or CSA high for the wallet instance. So this is something where we need to figure out how this will happen. But this will also come quite soon here. We also need to include more information on the reuse of evidence for more sources. Right now, in the annex that covers that, there are only 2 or 3 that are covered. We'll have more. Just that we didn't have time to complete this work, but I think we have a list of schemes that we can use as sources, and this work will get consolidated later. So. Also, something else that needs to be done at some point, which is basically consolidating all the content of the annexes. We can put some annexes, leave them as annexes, maybe have state-of-the-art documents if those can still exist. Maybe some other, for instance, if we could define an extension of the CAB requirements that could include a number of the annexes, including the the specific activities, also some other requirements that are there, the life cycle, etc. So we could have one document that covers a lot of the things that are under the responsibility of a camp, for instance. So this also needs to be decided together, I think, with the Commission in terms as we move towards the adoption. The requirements are not as major, so this, as I said before, will have to be considered again. So again, suggestions are very welcome. We're also working with the ESOs, and we'll keep working with them in the definition of these requirements. So basically, we're calling you for feedback. Now this is the first real opportunity here to provide some feedback, so we can have some detailed feedback of the draft candidate scheme and also on its annexes. And there can also be some feedback on the directions for the development of the security requirements. So it's basically, one of them is more detailed, I'd say, than the others. But before the thing is adopted, there will be more opportunities to contribute. Once we deliver to the Commission, they will draft an implementing act, and on this implementing act, there will be a have your say on this draft. So you'll have another opportunity to actually provide feedback on the scheme itself. And I think that will also go for another public review of the security requirements once they will be more major. So this will be done, I think, by ENISA before finalizing those. And of course, after the adoption of the scheme, if we can follow what is happening right now with the EUCC, we'll continue to work. For us in particular, we believe that the ESOs will continue to work on the requirements. Hopefully, we can have them make whatever requirements we'll develop for the first version of the scheme into some kind of a standard of technical spec, but also working on more detailed specifications that then can be mapped to these high-level requirements, and that will provide maybe more detailed information about how to implement specific functions of the ones. We should open some kind of a maintenance structure also that will be set up at this point, and that will be more open than the ad hoc working group. And that's it for the presentation part. So, sorry.
Eric, we cannot hear you.
I was trying to figure out people have actually an opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A, but I thought there would be.
I don't see any. I don't see any at the Q&A.
Yeah. Sorry for that. All right. So this idea about the WSCD, this is something that was actually covered by the Commission in the ARF right now by introducing the notion of key store. So at some point there was a question of having WSCDs with different levels. Now the idea is that there is one WSCD, that this thing is basically Van 5 or equivalent, certified with the UCC or equivalent, and it's used to store PID and the attestations that require that level of protection. But we can also have some key stores which also There can be some requirement for some attestations that would require them to be certified at some level or not. So this is basically the way it's handled now. So these key stores are actually supposed to be key stores that are managed at the level of the device. So you could have some key stores that are stored, in a secure element or any kind of things that is available on the device, a secure enclave, a TE, whatever, and then they are associated maybe with the level, so that the attestation providers know where they can store them. So this is something that is covered as of today, but it's not covered by, it's not fully covered, I would say, by a requirement there. So yeah, the question about the EID scheme level. So on the wallet, the wallet has to be provided with an EID scheme at assurance level high. So okay, that's what it is. So here we have a difference between the EID schemes that are provided, without a wallet or with a wallet. I think there was kind of an assumption that most of them will be provided with a wallet now. So the certification is required now for those with the wallets. So they would have to rely on the UCC for, I would say, the product part of the EID means. But if you look at the requirements of 2015, 1502, there's a lot of requirements that are not on the product parts, that are on the on the environment and the services around it. So all of these, will be quite similar in terms of requirements of what was done before. I said maybe with a slightly higher level of assurance here that we're asking for in the scheme.
Can you confirm this certification review is most relevant for member states, wallet providers, and not relying party?
So I'm not sure what you mean by the certification review, but the relying parties are not covered by the certification. They're not in scope. Relying parties and attribute providers or attestation providers, they're not in the scope. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't satisfy some requirements, but yeah, there's not today. There isn't anything now. This actually impacts a little bit the wallets because, of course, because they are not certified, we cannot in any way assume that they will do whatever they're supposed to do. So the relying parties cannot be trusted in any way. So the trust from the relying party has to come from the fact that they are, listed in a list of trusted, and they have some certificates signed by someone which is listed in a list of trusted entities, etc., etc. So there's actually a pretty complex chain of trust to get there that has to be very carefully checked. So yeah, that's one of the issues, of course, with the wallet. It would be easier for us if they were. So in particular, at least for the functional side. So in terms of the harmonized functional scheme, I think the Commission is working on actually not on a scheme, but on functional test specifications, which is the most important part of a scheme for functional conformance. Once you have a list of the list of the tests that you need to perform, I think you're very close to get one of these schemes, which are actually rather simple in terms of rules. So yes, this is done mostly by the Commission here. Yeah, so that's exactly. So there's a reference about the fact that on the 2024-2981, it says that the WSCA doesn't need to be CC certified at level 1.5 if the architecture provides sufficient assurance. This is exactly why we have these deviations things. So the idea is that we start by the assumption by saying, okay, the normal way of doing it is to have an EUCC certificate at Band 5. If you don't, explain what you're doing. And then if the explanation is convincing and that the deviation it comes with proper mitigation of all the risks that were initially covered, then it can be okay. So this is why we have all of this process before the actual testing, etc., to allow for these exceptions to actually happen. And this is actually one of the examples too. So I considered here that the WSCA was certified at Van 3 with CC, but it could also be certified at Van 3 with FITSAM, for instance. Is that sufficient? Possibly. So you just have to justify why you could actually use something else. Now, it still most likely will need to be certified somehow. It would be very hard to justify that you're not doing anything on it, but lowering the level is actually something that can be done by the deviation mechanism. Yeah. So there's a question about the fact that FITSAM includes a lot of things about protection, obfuscation, etc. But we know that the applications that run on user devices have to be made open source. So yes, there's a conflict there. This is something that we are aware of. Once again, there are different kinds of obfuscation here. So clearly, kind of renaming your code and whatever. So this is useless if you have access to the code, but there are also some other ways, mostly about making it more difficult to figure out how things are happening in terms of the dynamic analysis. So these, I would say, still apply to this particular context. But this is something also that we're covering. Document we're writing, which was not ready to be evaluated at this stage or shared in the review. But as I said, there will be another review for a more mature set of requirements, most likely coming also with some additions like what we propose around FITSAM. So about the national schemes. So there are some national schemes that have been submitted already to the Commission. So in terms of being aligned, I mean, they're aligned as much as they can be. Since the thing is not final on our side, it's difficult to be fully aligned to it. Now, we have also shared with the member states some template for the certification. So a lot of the member states, at least those that we've seen so far, have at least taken some of the principles from there. So there is an alignment on most of the most important aspects of things. But something also very important is that there is a big difference between the national schemes and the EU scheme, which is that the EU scheme has to be generic. It has to cover every single possible implementation of the thing, and there are many of them quite different from each other. On the other hand, a national scheme only needs to cover whatever wallet the member state intends to certify. So there's a big difference between a member state who intends to certify, for instance, a wallet that is solely based on web applications, so that there's pretty little reliance on the mobile on code on the mobile device, and a lot of things happening also in the back end in terms of storage in particular. Whereas if you have a lot of things happening on the device itself, then it's quite different. And there are many, many more ways of being different. So I would say that the EU scheme will necessarily be different. Now, the real question is, will you be able to certify with the EU scheme something that was certified already by basically reusing more or less the same evidence? I think that's what we're trying to achieve, that there is no extra work to be done that. So I would say that this is the more realistic goal that we have. And Once again, this is also a reason for having this maximal flexibility there in terms of architecture. Okay, so if there are no more questions, no? Okay.
No.
Yeah, all right. So I would just like to thank you very much for attending this session. Once again, you can still interact with us. This is we'll make sure that this can happen. Maybe one last question. Oh, no. All right. Thanks. So thank you very much for attending, and hopefully we'll get in touch. We'll keep you informed as much as we can about the continuation after that. Thank you for attending, and well, see you soon, hopefully. Thank you. Bye.